Disc 2.
Although not as prominent as Grant, arguably the most influential of the era's exponents of scientific racism, was Davenport's right-hand man, Harry Laughlin. Son of an Iowa preacher, Laughlin's expertise was in racehorse pedigrees and chicken breeding. He oversaw the operations of the Eugenics Record Office, but was at his most effective as a lobbyist. In the name of eugenics, he fanatically promoted forced sterilization measures and restrictions on the influx of genetically dubious foreigners, i.e., non-Northern Europeans. Particularly important historically was his role as an expert witness at congressional hearings on immigration. Laughlin gave full rein to his prejudices, all of them, of course, dressed up as science. When the data were problematic, he fudged them. When he unexpectedly found, for instance, that immigrant Jewish children did better than the native-born in public schools, Laughlin changed the categories he presented, lumping Jews in with whatever nation they had come from, thereby diluting away their superior performance. The passage in 1924 of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which severely restricted immigration from Southern Europe and elsewhere, was greeted as a triumph by the likes of Madison Grant. It was Harry Laughlin's finest hour. As vice president some years earlier, Calvin Coolidge had chosen to overlook both Native Americans and the nation's immigration history when he declared that America must remain American. Now, as president, he signed his wish into law. Like Grant, Laughlin had his fans among the Nazis, who modeled some of their own legislation on the American laws he had developed. In 1936, he enthusiastically accepted an honorary degree from Heidelberg University, which chose to honor him as the far-seeing representative of racial policy in America. In time, however, a form of late-onset epilepsy ensured that Laughlin's later years were especially pathetic. All his professional life, he had campaigned for the sterilization of epileptics on the grounds that they were genetically degenerate. Hitler's Mein Kampf is saturated with pseudo-scientific racist ranting derived from long-standing German claims of racial superiority and from some of the uglier aspects of the American eugenics movement. Hitler wrote that the state must declare unfit for propagation all who are in any way visibly sick or who have inherited a disease and can therefore pass it on and put this into actual practice. And elsewhere, those who are physically and mentally unhealthy and unworthy must not perpetuate their suffering in the body of their children. Shortly after coming to power in 1933, the Nazis had passed a comprehensive sterilization law. The law for the prevention of progeny with hereditary defects that was explicitly based on the American model. Laughlin proudly published a translation of the law. Within 3 years, 225,000 people had been sterilized. Positive eugenics, encouraging the right people to have children, also thrived in Nazi Germany, where right meant properly Aryan. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the Nazi elite corps, saw his mission in eugenic terms. SS officers should ensure Germany's genetic future by having as many children as possible. In 1936, he established special maternity homes for SS wives to guarantee that they got the best possible care during pregnancy. The proclamations at the 1935 Nuremberg rally included a law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited marriage between Germans and Jews, and even extramarital sexual intercourse between Jews and citizens of German or related blood. The Nazis were unfailingly thorough in closing up any reproductive loopholes. Neither, tragically, were there any loopholes in the U.S. Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that Harry Laughlin had worked so hard to engineer? For many Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, the United States was the logical first choice of destination. But the country's restrictive and racist immigration policies resulted in many being turned away. Not only had Laughlin's sterilization law provided Hitler with the model for his ghastly program, but his impact on immigration legislation meant that the United States would in effect abandon German Jewry to its fate at the hands of the Nazis. In 1939, with the war underway, the Nazis introduced euthanasia. Sterilization proved too much trouble, and why waste the food? The inmates of asylums were categorized as useless eaters. Questionnaires were distributed among the mental hospitals where panels of experts were instructed to mark them with a cross in the cases of patients whose lives they deemed not worth living. 75,000 came back so marked, and the technology of mass murder, the gas chamber, was duly developed. Subsequently, the Nazis expanded the definition of not worth living to include whole ethnic groups, among them the Gypsies, and in particular, the Jews. What came to be called the Holocaust was the culmination of Nazi eugenics. Eugenics ultimately proved a tragedy for humankind. It also proved a disaster for the emerging science of genetics, which could not escape the taint. In fact, despite the prominence of eugenicists like Davenport, many scientists had criticized the movement and disassociated themselves from it. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer with Darwin of natural selection, condemned eugenics in 1912 as simply the meddlesome interference of an arrogant scientific priestcraft. Thomas Hunt Morgan, of fruit fly fame, resigned on scientific grounds from the board of scientific directors of the Eugenics Record Office. Raymond Pearl at Johns Hopkins wrote in 1928 that orthodox eugenicists are going contrary to the best established facts of genetical science. Eugenics had lost its credibility in the scientific community long before the Nazis appropriated it for their own horrific purposes. The science underpinning it was bogus, and the social programs constructed upon it utterly reprehensible. Nevertheless, by mid-century, the valid science of genetics, human genetics in particular, had a major public relations problem on its hands. When in 1948 I first came to Cold Spring Harbor, former home of the by then defunct Eugenics Record Office, nobody would even mention the E word. Nobody was willing to talk about our science's past, even though past issues of the German Journal of Racial Hygiene still lingered on the shelves of the library. Realizing that such goals were not scientifically feasible, geneticists had long since forsaken the grand search for patterns of inheritance of human behavioral characteristics, whether Davenport's feeble-mindedness or Galton's genius, and were now focusing instead on the gene and how it functioned in the cell. With the development during the 1930s and 1940s of new and more effective technologies for studying biological molecules in ever greater detail, the time had finally arrived for an assault on the greatest biological mystery of all. What is the chemical nature of the gene?